A quick new idea, daily, from the world's greatest TEDx talks. I'm your host, Atossa Leoni, and this is TEDx Shorts. From a very early age, home, school, and religious environments mandate rigid roles for boys and girls. They set the foundation for inequalities between the sexes, consistently devaluing women's experiences in relation to men's. As adults, how can we undo these decades of socialization to foster greater gender equality? Soraya Chemaly is a writer and activist. In today's talk, Soraya explores how women's voices are systematically overlooked and suggests 3 ways to close this chasm between the sexes.
So one of the first stories that I remember hearing when I was about 5 was about my great-grandmother. And it went like this. When she was 14, the beautiful girl, and it always started that way because why else would this happen? The beautiful girl was walking in her village and a handsome man on a horse rode in, swept her off her feet, made her his wife. That's a euphemism, right? And off they went, traveled the world and had 7 children, and here we all are today. The next time I heard it, though, I was 11, and I had much more information. When I was 9, in my schoolyard, a boy had threatened to rape me. Street harassment, which has never ended, had already started. It was very aggressive street harassment where I lived, and no one talked about any of this. It was something that was hard for me to understand. So this time, I took a deep breath, and I said, you know what? She was kidnapped and assaulted and dragged across the planet. The person who did this should be punished. And that was my great-grandfather. And we loved him. He always laughed, and he took care of everybody. But I thought, how is it possible that we're telling this story this way? And this is what philosopher Miranda Flicker has a name for. She calls it epistemic injustice. Both my great-grandmother, who had no social construction to help her understand her life, and I were being denied the right to be knowers. At the point at which she lived, we just didn't talk about these things. There was literally no way to know what was happening to her. And so part of this that we all experience fairly regularly is something called testimonial injustice, which is that when someone hears us, they actually have a prejudice that doesn't allow them to think we're credible. So we go into spaces that are workplaces or educational environments, and there's a credibility deficit. But there's an interesting verbal activity that's going on. In mixed gender groups, in male-dominated spaces, so teaching or nursing, being administrative assistant, and in those spaces, we have less credibility. We know this from implicit bias. Implicit bias research basically says if you have just a male-sounding name, you have a much higher likelihood of getting a job, getting an academic mentor. What are we saying about knowledge? And what we're saying about knowledge is that men are more competent. Now, the thing that really struck me when I did research about this topic was how early it begins. Inequality actually begins in homes. And the interesting thing about it is that out in the world, this is very intersectional, meaning race affects the way we think of people, class affects the way we think of people, sexuality affects the way we think of people. But in homes, generally speaking, gender is the thing that is when we have interactions. They also sex segregate chores, which is true in all families except single-family homes. So girls will do traditionally girl chores and boys will do traditionally boy chores. In the same way that they distribute those chores, they have conversations with children. Now, teachers and parents both, when they talk to girls and boys, they have a very different way of speaking. And what they're saying to girls and boys is very different. They interrupt girls much more than they interrupt boys, and they talk over girls much more than they talk over boys. That sends a very powerful message about whose voice is important. They also very often expect different things in terms of boy and girl regulation. Who is capable of controlling themselves? Boys and girls actually have the same ability to control themselves, but we have different expectations, and those biases affect the way parents and teachers interact with boys and girls both. An important component in childhood to me is religion. How many people here have gone to religious services in either a synagogue or a mosque or a church where women cannot serve with authority as clerics? Yes? Boys go into those spaces and they learn that they have authority. Girls go into those spaces and they learn to be silent, right? And what they end up with is a sex-based entitlement to public voice and public power. We use words like mankind, and we use images of human beings that are all men all the time. And when we do that, we erase women. So in this room, for example, how many people have said mankind and not thought about it? Anyone? Right? And when we do that, if we say a word like actor or a word like actress, over and over again, we're reinforcing this idea that man is at the center, men are at the center, and women are something else, slightly different. Now, in spaces where there are not a lot of women, especially in leadership, so the higher you go, the fewer women there are, in those spaces, and all of that is tied to whether we can be knowers. So when feminists say, as they have been for centuries, are women human? This is what we're talking about, right? We're objectified, we're silenced. Those stories that we all have, they are not out in the world as profusely as they need to be. And so when I see those roomfuls of men, even though they may individually be wonderful people, and they may be making what they think are ethical decisions, there is an epistemological flaw in the culture that means they simply are not diverse enough to capture what we need to capture for the world to be a more just place. I was going to close by saying everything has to change, and I'm going to leave that to you. But I can't do that. So I have three things. The first thing I would say is be knowers, not pleasers. We are still, all of us collectively, creating an environment for children in schools and at home where they are learning that girls are pleasers, that we should be more quiet, that we should be more helpful, but it establishes a pattern for adulthood. Teach children that girls are not just pleasers, but that they can be knowers. And when you teach manners, don't have those manners be about ladies and gentlemen. The second thing is that you need to practice that equality at home, and you need to take it into institutions with you. So the dynamics that I'm talking about, it may be that in your own home, there's a chore gap, right? Generally speaking, in all of the world, women are still doing the overwhelming amount of domestic work. It turns out that one of the greatest indicators of a girl's ambition is if she has a father in the home who does cross-gender chores. Now think about that. It just means, I don't like taking out the garbage. It means I take out the garbage and my husband makes dinner. It's a small thing. We don't even think about it because we're trying to be more efficient. That has to go into schools. One of the biggest vectors for sexism that I can ever imagine is the way our schools are teaching children. First of all, it's sex segregated by default because teachers tend to be overwhelmingly women, and they're excellent women, but we need men to teach, right? We need men to be nurturers. We need them to be setting examples in schools. We need them to be interacting with both boys and girls. Whether it's a sex segregated school or not, it's more a matter of how integrated the teaching staff may be, right? That sends a very strong message to children. And so I'm going to leave you by saying my great-grandmother literally lost her voice. People remember her sitting on a veranda at the end of her life trembling, and she never spoke. Today, we would have words for that. We would talk about trauma, but that wasn't the case then. They said that she'd lost her mind. And so I thought, this isn't a person who's lost her mind. This is a person faced with an incomprehensible life. And she's kept her mind. She's kept her mind to herself, which was her only recourse. The change that we have now is that we're able to talk about these things, and that's important. So the last thing I would tell you is I'm here telling her story, which is a huge change in the last 50 years, and you have that power too. Don't bite your tongue.
The TEDx talk you just listened to was recorded at a TEDx event in Barcelona, Spain. All TEDx events are independently organized by volunteers who believe in TED's mission of ideas worth spreading. Special thanks to the organizing team at TEDxBarcelonaWomen. Want to listen to the full talk? Find Soraya's talk and more at TED.com/TEDxShorts. I'm Atossa Leoni. Thanks for listening, and see you tomorrow.